This conference is brought to you by CallStack, a total software engineering consultancy.
I heard there were supposed to be some kind of sparkles. I don't know if I got that. If not, I'm really bummed, because that sounds cool. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here at React Universe Conf. My name is Aurora. I'm a web developer from Norway, and I work as a consultant at Inmeta in Oslo. And we have a very similar name. It's very confusing, but that's not Meta. And I also had kind of a hectic travel. I was invited last minute. And that's why I'm really excited to be teaching you today about working with forms and React Server components in practice. And I'm going to be coding a simplified version of something that I've made for my current consultancy project, where it's working well for us. So let's get started by looking at the setup. So I'm here in the Next.js app router, and using Prisma as my ORM and a local database, and then I have Tailwind. And since I'm using the app router, everything here is a server component by default. So everything you see on the page is a server component, and the message box component is also a server component. And what that means is that this component will run only on the server and will never have any JS on the client, and that's why we can do database queries inside here. So the getMessages function is querying the database and getting messages. And then it's also getting the current user and mapping into individual message display components. And again, this doesn't require any interactivity, so it's just going to be a server component, styling based on whether the user has written the message. And finally, there's a message input. This one doesn't do a whole lot yet. You can try it out. Nothing's going to happen. So the goal here is to enhance this message box with React Server components and make it interactive while minimizing the JS on the client and reducing the front-end complexity. So let's get started by making this form work. We're going to do that by using the React 19 extension of the form element with the action property, which can now call a function. We're going to bind it to a server action. That's going to be submit message. And I will define that inside my data access layer here, submit message. And since it's going to be a server action, we will use the directive useServer. And what this will do is essentially define or create a hidden API endpoint that allows us to expose the functions inside this file to the client and call them from anywhere. And we also get type safety through RPC. So I'm going to export an async function here, which is submit message. And this will take in a form data object of type form data. Let's see, form data. Is this supposed to be capital? Yeah. And what this means is that each input inside the form will be submitted with its value inside this form data object. And we can use this to mutate in our database and create a message with some data where the content will be from the form data. And we also need a created by ID here, which means that I need to somehow pass an additional argument to this function. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can use the .bind on a function, or you can use a hidden input. And in this case, I'm going to do a hidden input. And I'm just going to bind it to the user ID. And I will import this function. And I have to put a bit of a disclaimer here, because you don't want to pass the user ID from the client in a real app. This is just an example of how you could pass an additional parameter. Some kind of server-side authentication setup, like getCurrentUser, would be what you want to use. But for now, we're going to use that and wrap this up. And let's try it out. So I'm going to make a message here and manually refresh the page. And I've been able to submit a message, just like that. Of course, I don't want to manually refresh the page, so I will just call Next.js for validate path, which means that it will purge the server component cache on this route and regenerate whatever is on it. So now I can say hello, and it's been added there without refreshing it. It's just been at the bottom there. So that was all that was required to add a message to the database here. And if I had used the onSubmit here, I would have had to wait for this form to be hydrated by JavaScript to be able to submit, whereas this one will work without JavaScript because it's essentially just using the post endpoint that was created. But I didn't actually see that my message was submitted because I was stuck in this scroll position here. So what I can do is I can go to the message box component, and I can change this div into an automatic scroller. And this component is a client component because it needs to use an effect and a mutation observer to automatically scroll to the bottom of the container when a new child is inserted. And here's the container. So this is something that we need JavaScript on the client to do. But since it's taking in the children property here and rendering inside the div, we can still pass server components. And this was really beautifully explained by Delba this morning, which means that only the scroller here is on the client. So let's first try it out. Scroll. So it's now scrolling to the bottom of the page, or the container. And let's also get some proof that it's that this is the only component on the client by looking inside the DevTools and the tree. And we can see that these message display components are not in the React tree. Only the automatic scroller is in the tree. But let's get back to the message input. Because I'm getting something from the client, I should be validating to make sure I know that it's safe. And I'm going to do that by getting a validation result from a message schema, which is using Zod, which is a schema validation library or a runtime validation library, which will check that my object is of this specific structure, which requires at least one character content and a unique ID for the user ID. And I can safely parse and my data object here. And I don't need to type these as strings anymore. And I will use the result to insert into my database. And TypeScript tells me I have to also make sure that this succeeded. So I'm going to make sure that if the result is not a success, I can throw an error and say just invalid message data. Let's see. There we go. So if I now comment out my client-side validation here and trigger this invalid message, it will throw an error. And OK, throwing errors, that's good. And it's up to you however you want to handle that, but one way is to use an error boundary. So if I head over to the message box, I can add an error boundary around this message input. And try it again. And now it will be caught by this error boundary. So I'm going to put this validation back. Because I don't really want to throw an error for this case, I would rather return something. So instead of throwing an error, I'm going to return an object with the error that I want to display, which is going to be invalid message data, and a success false, and a timestamp. And we're going to see later why we're needing that. So I'm just going to create it for now. And that's OK. And you could also, by the way, return form field validation errors here if you want, if you have a bigger form. But I just have one input, so I don't need to do that. And maybe you want to check for something else, query your database, decide what's going to happen inside this server action here. And in my case, I'm going to limit the max number of messages the user can send by getting the messages for the user with a get messages function with the user ID. And if this is, let's say, bigger than more than 5, we will return an error with user has reached the message limit, success false, and the timestamp. And if all is well, we can mutate, revalidate the path, and then finally return success true, like that. And if for some reason this goes wrong, we will just let the error boundary deal with that for us. So I have a lot of server-side logic here, and I need to get this to the message input and to the user somehow. So I'm going to head over here and use the React 19 hook, use action state. And it will take in a function to call, or the action, which is going to be submit message, and an initial state. And in our case, it's just going to be success false. And what it returns is a generated component state, which is going to be equal to first the initial state, and then after that, the last returned value of the action that useActionState is wrapping. And it will also return a wrapped action to call, which is going to be submit message action by convention. I'm going to put this on the form and use the state to show an error message down here. And I have a couple problems because I'm trying to use useActionState. This is a hook. I need to tell the bundler to load the JavaScript on the client to be able to use this with useClient. And I also have to fix this TypeScript error because useActionState will pass an additional argument to the function that it's wrapping, which is going to be the previous state. And I don't need that here, but I still have to add it. So I'm just going to quickly write a type for that. There we go. So let's see how that works now. So I'm going to try again. Hello. It's all good. And then I hit my max message count here, and the error from submit message has been rendered underneath the form, which is pretty cool. But I want to make it feel more interactive. So instead of just doing a simple span, I'm going to use an effect to, if the state has an error, toast an error with that error. And I need to add the dependency array. And I have to depend on the error, but also this timestamp that I created. And let's see how that feels now. A lot better, which means I don't need the text here anymore. But instead of removing it, I can leave it as a no script fallback, so that for some reason, if there is no JavaScript, I will still be able to see what's happening in this form, or what's going wrong. So now I just get this toast again. But there is a couple more things to fix here, because when I'm submitting this and I'm getting the error, the form is resetting. And the reason it's doing that is because when you use the form action property with uncontrolled inputs in React 19, the form will automatically reset all the fields on the action completion. And that's a good thing because it kind of copies this MPA form submission behavior. And maybe you've been using controlled form states, like with React Hook Form, you would be controlling the inputs. In this case, we're not. But we still want to be able to modify this value if we could have changed it and then made it valid again. So to do that, I'm going to also return the content that was submitted here and use it as the default value of the input field. And now, when useActionState has content in this returned state, it will stay inside the input field there. And there's one more thing, because I'm using a local database here. And let's say that in the real world, you have to wait a while for the round trip to the server and back. This could be kind of slow. And the way that feels for the user is that I'm clicking and I don't see any feedback right away. And if I was like submitting a message, maybe I'd be submitting multiple by accident. That's not a good experience. So useActionState actually returns a third value, is pending. And I can use this to disable my button here and say something else inside the button here. So like, if it's pending, we're going to say it's sending. So now while I'm waiting for this slow submit message, I will see sending, and I won't be able to send multiple by accident. So let me just, oh yeah, and if you compare this pattern to the old way using the pages router or wherever where you're handling your loading states and your error starts on your own, the useAction hook kind of just puts everything into one easy to use hook here. But let me put increase the max message count here and just see that we're back to normal. So I'm going to submit a message. It will be sending. It's scrolling, and it's clearing the field. But what's cool here is that this whole form actually works without JavaScript. So let's just check out the console and disable the JavaScript for this and try to write something. So I got a full page refresh. I didn't get any scrolling, and I did not get any feedback on the button, but everything still worked. So let's see it again. Yep, all is well. And then one more. And I just hit this max message count, and the no script fallback has been displayed in this case. So I'm just going to get back here. And we're back to the JavaScript version here. So what we've essentially been doing here is progressively enhancing this form, meaning we're making sure the base case will always work for the lowest amount of resources, which is no JavaScript, and then progressively enhancing, adding things on top to enhance the user experience for those users with these resources available. So let's say that your user is on a slow device and is waiting for JavaScript to download, parse, and execute. Well, now this form will work before any of that's happened, and the JavaScript that we do want will hydrate faster because we reduce the amount of JS on the client by weaving together the server components and the client components in this way. And basically, depending on your user situation, they will always have a form that works and then get the better experience. But let's spend some time and talk about the reusability here, because the is-pending flag is great, but what if I wanted to use the same logic of a spinner, or sorry, a submit button that's disabled somewhere else? Maybe that component is not even using use action state. So what I'm going to do is extract this button into a reusable UI component called submit button. And we're just going to paste whatever we were using in here. And I need to get the is pending value from somewhere. So I'm going to use another React 19 hook called use from status. And the way this works is that it will use the parent form as a provider and return a bunch of things about the currently submitting form. So it will return the data submitted, a pending flag, the action used, and the method used. But we're only going to need the pending here. So there you go. And then I have to make this a client component, because this is something that's going to run on the client as we click. So I'm going to say use client. And instead of saying sending, that's not reusable, we're going to just return a nicely styled div with a spinner. And the children of this component. And if it's not pending, we can just return the children. So I'm going to have to make some props here. There you go, like that, add it to the component. And what you could do here to make this better is to add an additional is loading so that you can trigger this in a different way, not using a form. Or you want to extend the button props here so you can add area attributes and all your other stuff. But this is OK for now. And let's try using that inside our message box here. So we're going to say submit button with send. And see how it feels. So it's got this nice spinner now. And that's cool, but what's great about the submit button is I can throw this into anywhere in my app, even in server components. So I'm in the message box. I just want to make a feature to reset the messages. So I'm just going to put it here and say reset. And I'm going to import it. I need a form with an action to reset the messages. And that, I can just make that inline right now. An async function, reset messages. And it's going to be a server action. It's going to be slow. It's going to delete all the messages from the database. And it's also going to revalidate the path. So remember, I'm on the server here, and even though I just put the component like this, I will still get this nice client-side feedback, which is pretty amazing. So it's entirely composable. Yes. I want to show one more thing. Oh. One more thing, which is the use optimistic hook, because I've been progressively enhancing this form further. So I'm just going to get rid of this code and jump over to a different branch. And I haven't done a whole lot here. I've just extracted the messages functionality into a new component, which is receiving the messages from the server. And in this component, it's become a client component because I want to use the React 19 hook use optimistic. And what this hook does is it will take in the state to show when no action is pending, which is going to be the messages from the server, and a update function or a reducer function. And this defines what will happen when we do an optimistic update. And in this case, it's just going to say is sending true to the messages that is optimistic. And it's returning the optimistic messages and the function to trigger the optimistic update. And this will be passed to the message input. And here, I've added this additional onSubmit function. So the action that we were using before is just now, this is functioning as the fallback, and the onSubmit will be our progressive enhancement for the optimistic update. And inside the onSubmit, I'm doing some stuff to maintain the progressive enhancement with the default value here, starting a transition with the optimistic update, and then the actual mutation, and then resetting the form. So let's see how that feels. Optimistic. So right away, it's been submitted, and it's sending. So what's happening is, as we're waiting for the server to respond, we have this client state, which is sending. And then when the server returns with the truth, it will be replaced. And the sending is no longer showing. So they're all sending, and then they settle as the server returns with the update. And I can keep sending more here. And it's all good until I hit this max message count. And the optimistic messages are rolled back. Because they only exist on the client, they don't exist in the server state that's being replaced here. Yeah, so the bottom line here is that depending on your application, you can decide by your requirements, and you can still use your React hook form if that's what you want to, but you also have the ability to use these more primitive features of the form component with React 19 and React Server components to build forms that are very robust while still having a really great user experience. So that's it for this demo. The code is pinned on my GitHub if you want to check it out. And thank you for listening. Thank you, React Universe Conf, for having me here.